Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
It's good to be back.
Today, we're diving into Catherine Mansfield's The Garden Party, um, a story that I think you'll agree really kind of gets under your skin and stays with you.
Yeah, definitely. It's one of those stories that just keeps coming back to you long after you've finished it.
And we've got some excellent source material to help us unpack it.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at the story's historical context, the characters, the themes, and we're going to try to figure out just what makes this story so captivating and so thought-provoking.
Exactly. And, I think one of the things that makes this story so compelling is that it takes place in this very specific time and place, right? The early 20th century New Zealand.
Right, and Mansfield does such an amazing job of capturing the social dynamics of that era.
Yeah.
The rigid class divisions, the expectations placed on women, and this kind of underlying sense of unease that permeates the whole society.
Absolutely. And all of that is kind of bubbling beneath the surface of this seemingly simple story about a garden party.
Right? It's like she's using this very ordinary event to explore these much larger questions about life and death and the way we interact with each other.
So let's get into it, shall we? The story opens with the Sheridans, this wealthy family, who are preparing for a lavish garden party.
And Mansfield really throws us right into the middle of the action.
Yeah.
We see them bustling about, getting everything ready, the flowers, the food, the music.
It's like we can almost smell the Lillers and hear the clinking of champagne glasses.
Exactly. And she uses such vivid language to describe everything, like those canna lilies. She says they're frighteningly alive.
It's such a striking image, isn't it? And it kind of foreshadows this idea that beneath the surface of all this beauty and festivity, there's something a little bit unnerving, something a little bit unsettling.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The whole atmosphere is charged with this kind of nervous energy, like something is about to happen.
Right. And then, of course, something does happen.
The news of the accident.
Exactly. Just as the Sheridans are lost in this world of, party preparations, they receive news that a man has been killed in a tragic accident just down the road.
And as a man from the poor neighborhood, right? A stark contrast to the Sheridan's world of privilege.
Right. And the way Mansfield describes the arrival of this news is so interesting. Godber's man, he's this kind of rough around the edges caterer's assistant. He comes bursting in.
Almost relishing the news, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Like it's a juicy bit of gossip.
Exactly. And the Sheridans, they're initially shocked, of course, but they quickly try to brush it off.
Like it's an inconvenience more than anything else.
Right. It's almost like they can't even comprehend the tragedy because it's so far removed from their own reality.
And that's where we really start to see the theme of class difference emerge.
Right. Because for the Sheridans, this death is an abstraction. It's something that happens to other people who live in a different world.
But for Laura, the youngest Sheridan daughter, the news hits much harder.
She's horrified. She wants to cancel the party.
She can't understand why everyone else isn't more upset.
And that's where we see this tension between Laura's sense of empathy and her family's more detached, almost callous response.
And it really makes you question, right, whose response is more appropriate? How should we react to suffering, especially when it happens outside our own social circle?
These are such important questions, and I think that's one of the things that makes the garden party so relevant even today.
Absolutely, because we're still grappling with these same issues of class and social responsibility.
So what happens next? What's Laura's reaction to her family's indifference?
Well, she tries to convince them that they should cancel the party,
Yeah.
right? She feels like it's just wrong to be celebrating when someone has died so tragically.
But her family, they just don't see it that way, do they?
Not at all.
No.
They try to reason with her. They tell her she's being oversensitive.
And they even try to distract her, right, with that beautiful hat.
Oh, yeah, that hat becomes a really important symbol in the story.
It represents Laura's privilege, her family's preoccupation with appearances.
And it's almost like the hat itself is trying to seduce her back into this world of carefree indulgence.
But does she give in? Does she let herself be swept back into the excitement of the party?
That's a great question, and that's what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
So stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back after a quick break. Okay, so we left off with Laura kind of torn right between her empathy for the dead man and her family's insistence that the party must go on.
Right. She's caught in this moral dilemma, and that beautiful hat that her mother gave her, it's almost like a symbol of that dilemma. It represents the allure of beauty and pleasure, but it also feels kind of inappropriate given the circumstances.
So how does she resolve this conflict?
Well, she doesn't really resolve it right away. In fact, she kind of tries to ignore it for a while. She gets caught up in the preparations for the party. She enjoys the attention she's getting.
But it's clear that she's still troubled by the news of the death.
Oh, absolutely. It's like this little voice inside her head keeps whispering that something isn't right.
And eventually she decides that she needs to do something. She needs to acknowledge the tragedy in some way.
So she comes up with this idea to take a basket of leftover sandwiches and cakes to the dead man's family.
It's like she's trying to make amends, to bridge the gap between her world of privilege and the world of poverty and suffering that she's just glimpsed.
But it's also clear that she's nervous about going to the poor neighborhood. She's never really been exposed to that kind of poverty before.
And she's also aware of how out of place she'll look in her fancy clothes and that beautiful hat.
Right. It's like she's suddenly self-conscious about her privilege in a way that she's never been before.
So she sets off on this kind of symbolic journey down the hill from her family's grand house to the smoky and dark lane where the dead man lived.
And as she gets closer to her destination, the atmosphere changes, right? It becomes more somber, more oppressive.
Mansfield uses some really vivid imagery to describe this transition. The sun is setting, the air is thick with smoke, and the lane itself is narrow and crowded.
It's like she's entering a different world, a world that's both literally and metaphorically darker than her own.
And then she arrives at the dead man's house, and it's surrounded by a crowd of mourners.
She's immediately struck by the poverty of the place, the smallness of the house, the shabbiness of the clothes that the people are wearing.
And she feels incredibly out of place in her shining frock and that hat.
She almost wants to turn around and go back,
Yeah.
but she forces herself to go inside.
And that's where the story takes this really interesting turn.
Because when she sees the dead man lying on the bed, she doesn't feel repulsed or frightened.
She's actually struck by his peacefulness.
Mansfield describes him as looking wonderful, beautiful, as if death has brought him a kind of serenity that he never had in life.
And Laura has this epiphany. She realizes that death isn't this horrible, terrifying thing. It's just a natural part of life.
And she sees the dead man not as a drunken workman, which is how her sister described him, but simply as a human being.
A human being who has reached the end of his journey.
And in that moment, all the superficial differences between them, class, social status, all of that just melts away.
And she whispers this really poignant line, "Forgive my hat."
It's like she's apologizing for her privilege, for her family's indifference, for the fact that they're having a party while this man's family is grieving.
It's such a powerful moment, and it really highlights this theme of empathy that runs throughout the story.
Laura's able to see beyond the social divisions and recognize the shared humanity that connects us all.
But even though she's had this profound experience, she still has to go back to her own world.
Right. She has to return to the party, to the music and the laughter and the beautiful lilies.
And you have to wonder, how will this experience change her? Will she be able to go back to her old life, or will she be forever haunted by what she's seen?
That's what we'll be discussing in the final part of our deep dive. So stay with us, folks. We'll be right back after a short break.
All right, so Laura, she's back at the party after that incredibly moving encounter with the dead man's family.
And you can just imagine what's going through her mind, right? The contrast between the somber scene she just witnessed and the lively atmosphere of the party.
Like trying to reconcile these two completely different worlds.
Exactly. And Mansfield doesn't explicitly tell us what Laura's thinking, but we can feel her internal struggle through her actions and interactions.
She's clearly changed by the experience.
Oh, absolutely. She's not the same carefree girl who was so excited about the party just a few hours ago.
And that's when she sees her brother, Laurie.
Ah, Laurie. He plays a really interesting role in this story.
He's kind of an outsider himself, right?
Yeah, he's more sensitive, more attuned to the world around him than the rest of the family.
And he immediately susses that something is different about Laura.
He doesn't even have to ask her what's wrong. He just knows.
And they have this brief but really profound conversation.
It's more like a silent understanding, really.
They both realize that they've glimpsed something important, something about the fragility of life and the interconnectedness of all human beings.
But they struggle to articulate it, you know?
Like they're both fumbling for words.
And in the end, Laurie just says, "Isn't it, darling?"
And that simple phrase speaks volumes, doesn't it?
It acknowledges the weight of the experience without trying to explain it or diminish it.
And it suggests that sometimes the most profound truths are the ones that can't be put into words.
I think that's one of the things that makes the garden party so powerful. It leaves us with more questions than answers.
It invites us to contemplate these big themes of life and death and class and social responsibility.
And to come to our own conclusions.
And it reminds us that even in the midst of celebration and beauty, there's always this undercurrent of sadness and loss.
That life is precious and fleeting, and we should cherish every moment.
So what do you think, folks? Did Laura make the right decision by going to the dead man's house? Should she have canceled the party?
There's no easy answer, is there?
I think that's the beauty of this story. It challenges us to think critically and to empathize with characters who are very different from ourselves.
And to acknowledge the complexity of the human experience.
Well said. I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive into the garden party.
It's been a pleasure diving into this story with you.
Likewise, and to our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this exploration of Catherine Mansfield's masterpiece, and we encourage you to read it for yourselves and see what insights you uncover.
Until next time, happy reading.
And happy deep diving.